Bashar al-Assad's path to power was not preordained. Born into a prominent Syrian family, Bashar was not initially destined for politics. His elder brother Basil was being groomed for leadership. Bashar, meanwhile, pursued a career in medicine, training as an ophthalmologist in London. He seemed destined for a life outside the tumultuous world of Syrian politics. However, fate intervened in 1994 with the death of Basil in a car accident. This tragedy thrust Bashar into the spotlight. He returned to Syria, taking on a more prominent role within the ruling family. His father, Hafez al-Assad, began preparing him for leadership. In 2000, Hafez al-Assad died after 3 decades in power. Bashar, then just 34 years old, was quickly appointed to succeed him. The constitution was amended to lower the age requirement for the presidency, paving the way for his ascension. Bashar al-Assad's rise to power was swift and unexpected. He assumed the presidency with a limited political background, inheriting a country grappling with economic challenges and a legacy of authoritarian rule. The world watched with cautious optimism, wondering what direction this young, seemingly reform-minded leader would take Syria. In the years before the civil war, Syria presented a complex picture. On the surface, there were signs of progress. The economy experienced modest growth, fueled by oil revenues and some tentative economic liberalization. The internet began to penetrate Syrian society, offering a glimpse of the outside world. However, beneath this veneer of progress, deep-seated problems festered. Corruption was rampant, hindering economic development and breeding resentment. The Assad regime, while allowing for some social freedoms, maintained a tight grip on political power. The Ba'ath Party, in power since 1963, dominated the political landscape. Opposition parties, though technically permitted, faced severe restrictions. The security services, notorious for their brutality, stifled dissent and maintained a climate of fear. Despite these challenges, a sense of normalcy persisted for many Syrians. Life went on, with its rhythms of work, family, and tradition. Few could have predicted the cataclysmic events that would soon engulf their nation. The year 2011 witnessed a wave of uprisings across the Arab world, as people rose up against authoritarian rulers. Syria, with its own history of political repression, proved ripe for unrest. The spark came in the southern city of Daraa in March 2011. Inspired by events in Tunisia and Egypt, a group of teenagers spray-painted anti-regime graffiti on a school wall. Their arrest and alleged torture ignited protests in Daraa, which quickly spread to other parts of the country. Protesters demanded political reforms, greater freedoms, and an end to corruption. The Assad regime's response was swift and brutal. Security forces opened fire on peaceful demonstrators, killing and injuring scores of people. This violent crackdown only fueled the flames of dissent, transforming what began as peaceful protests into armed rebellion. As the violence escalated, the country descended into chaos. The Syrian army fractured, with some units defecting to join the opposition. Neighboring countries were drawn into the conflict, providing support to different sides. What began as a popular uprising had morphed into a full-blown civil war, with devastating consequences for Syria and the wider region. The Syrian opposition, united in its goal of ousting Bashar al-Assad, proved to be a fractured and heterogeneous movement. From the outset, a dizzying array of groups emerged, each with its own ideology, goals, and allegiances. This fragmentation would plague the opposition throughout the conflict, hindering its effectiveness against the Assad regime. One of the earliest groups to emerge was the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. Composed largely of defectors from the Syrian army, the FSA initially presented a more secular and moderate alternative to the Assad regime. However, it lacked a cohesive structure and struggled to secure consistent funding and weaponry. As the conflict dragged on, more extreme Islamist groups gained prominence. Jabhat al-Nusra, affiliated with al-Qaeda, emerged as a powerful force, exploiting the chaos to carve out territory and impose its strict interpretation of Islamic law. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, even more radical and brutal, seized control of vast swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq, declaring a caliphate in 2014. Adding to the complexity were Kurdish groups in northern Syria who sought autonomy from both the Assad regime and the Arab-dominated opposition. The Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, aligned with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK in Turkey, emerged as a formidable fighting force, proving particularly effective against ISIS. The Syrian opposition, a tapestry of ideologies and agendas, struggled to present a united front against the Assad regime. This fragmentation, coupled with shifting alliances and external interference, would have profound consequences for the trajectory of the conflict. Section 5. Shifting Sands of Allegiance. The Syrian civil war became a tangled web of international alliances and rivalries, with external powers playing a decisive role in shaping the conflict's trajectory. For Bashar al-Assad, securing the support of key allies proved crucial to his regime's survival. Russia, a longtime ally of Syria, emerged as Assad's most steadfast backer. In 2015, Russia intervened militarily in the conflict, launching airstrikes against opposition forces and providing crucial support to the Syrian army. This intervention significantly bolstered Assad's position, tilting the balance of power in his favor. Iran, another key ally, provided extensive military and financial support to the Assad regime. Iranian-backed militias, including Hezbollah from Lebanon, played a significant role in bolstering Assad's forces on the ground. Iran viewed the survival of the Assad regime as vital to its regional interests, particularly in maintaining its supply lines to Hezbollah in Lebanon. On the other side of the conflict, the United States, while initially hesitant to intervene directly, provided support to select rebel groups deemed moderate. However, this support proved inconsistent and often ineffective. The U.S. also backed Kurdish forces in northern Syria, seeing them as a reliable partner in the fight against ISIS. Turkey, a NATO member, found itself in a complex position. While officially opposed to the Assad regime, Turkey's primary concern was the growing strength of Kurdish forces in northern Syria, whom it viewed as a threat to its own national security. Turkey launched military incursions into Syria, targeting Kurdish groups and further complicating the conflict's dynamics. The Syrian civil war became a proxy war, with external powers vying for influence and pursuing their own strategic objectives. This international dimension prolonged the conflict, adding layers of complexity to an already intractable situation. Section 6 echoes of Hama, the Assad regime's brutal campaign. As the civil war raged, the Assad regime, determined to crush the rebellion, resorted to brutal tactics that left an indelible mark on the Syrian psyche. The regime's ruthlessness, reminiscent of Hafez al-Assad's brutal suppression of an uprising in Hama in 1982, shocked the world and fueled the cycle of violence. One of the most egregious examples of the regime's brutality was its use of chemical weapons against civilians. In August 2013, a sarin gas attack in the Ghouta suburbs of Damascus killed hundreds of people, including many children. The images of lifeless bodies, bearing the silent testimony of a horrific crime, sparked international outrage. Beyond chemical weapons, the Assad regime employed a systematic campaign of barrel bombing, indiscriminate airstrikes that reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Hospitals, schools, and markets were deliberately targeted, terrorizing the civilian population and making life unbearable in rebel-held areas. The regime's security apparatus, notorious for its brutality, engaged in widespread torture, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearances. Tens of thousands of people were detained, often without charge or trial, and subjected to horrific abuse in government prisons. The Assad regime's brutality, driven by a determination to cling to power at all costs, had a devastating impact on Syrian society. It sowed the seeds of deep-seated hatred and resentment, making reconciliation a distant prospect and ensuring that the scars of this conflict would linger for generations. Section 7. The Price of War, a Nation in Ruins. The Syrian civil war exacted a devastating toll on the country, leaving its economy in shambles, its infrastructure decimated, and its social fabric in tatters. The human cost of the conflict is immeasurable, with hundreds of thousands killed and millions displaced, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history. The war shattered Syria's economy, once a modest but functioning system. Years of fighting destroyed factories, businesses, and agricultural land. The country's infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and power grids, lay in ruins. The Syrian pound plummeted in value, leading to hyperinflation and widespread poverty. The war triggered a mass exodus of Syrians, fleeing the violence and seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. Millions became internally displaced, crowding into makeshift camps or seeking shelter in bombed-out buildings. Neighboring countries, particularly Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, struggled to cope with the influx of refugees, straining their resources and social fabric. Beyond the physical destruction, the war inflicted deep psychological wounds on the Syrian people. Years of violence, displacement, and loss left many traumatized, struggling to cope with the horrors they had witnessed. The war tore apart families, shattered communities, and eroded the social bonds that had once held Syrian society together. The Syrian civil war, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, left the country in ruins. Rebuilding Syria, both physically and psychologically, will require a Herculean effort, one that will likely take generations to complete. Section 8. A resurgence of chaos. The 2024 offensive. Just when the echoes of war seemed to be fading, with the Assad regime seemingly regaining control over much of the country, a dramatic resurgence of violence erupted in late 2024. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a powerful jihadist group that had rebranded itself, launched a major offensive in northern Syria, catching the Assad regime off guard. The HTS offensive, aided by a confluence of factors including the Assad regime's weakened state and dwindling support from its allies, achieved remarkable success. HTS fighters, battle-hardened and well-equipped, captured key cities, including Hama, once a symbol of the regime's brutality. They advanced rapidly towards Damascus, sending shockwaves through the regime's heartland. This resurgence of fighting shattered the illusion of stability that had begun to take hold in parts of Syria. It underscored the fragility of the situation, reminding the world that the Syrian conflict, far from being over, could easily flare up again, with devastating consequences. The 2024 offensive had profound implications for the Assad regime. It exposed the regime's vulnerabilities, demonstrating that it was not as firmly in control as it had appeared. The offensive also strained Assad's relationship with his allies, particularly Russia, who grew increasingly frustrated with his inability to secure a decisive victory. Section 9. Assad's uncertain future, a legacy marred by conflict. As of December 2024, Bashar al-Assad's future hangs in the balance. The HTS offensive has weakened his grip on power, exposing the fragility of his regime and raising questions about his ability to maintain control. The country lies in ruins, its economy shattered, and its people deeply divided. Assad's visit to Moscow in November 2024, seeking Putin's support in the face of the HTS advance, highlighted his regime's precarious position. Russia, while still backing Assad, has grown increasingly frustrated with the Syrian leader's inability to quell the rebellion and bring stability to the country. The Syrian people, exhausted by years of war and bloodshed, face an uncertain future. Millions remain displaced, their lives shattered by the conflict. The country's infrastructure lies in ruins, and its economy is in shambles. Rebuilding Syria, both physically and psychologically, will be a monumental task. Bashar al-Assad's legacy, once envisioned as one of reform and modernization, will forever be intertwined with the devastation of the Syrian civil war. The conflict has left an indelible mark on Syria, fracturing its society, destroying its economy, and turning it into a battleground for regional and international powers. As Syria enters a new and uncertain chapter, the question remains, what will rise from the ashes of this once proud nation?